Hello students, I'm Dr. Himanshu Kandpal, Assistant Professor English, Government MS College for Women, Bikaner. Today I will discuss metaphysical movement. By the end of the 16th and the beginning of the 17th century, the great Elizabethan poetry had exhausted itself. We can see the signs of decadence. There were three traditions that were generally followed at that time: the Spenserian tradition, the Arcadian, and the Petrarchan tradition. Everything was conventional and artificial. There was little that was original or remarkable. There was much sugared melody and romantic extravagance, but intellectual emptiness. So, in the first decades of the 17th century, there was a revolt against the outdated and exhausted Elizabethan poetry. The leaders of this revolt were Ben Jonson and John Donne. Both of them were forceful personalities who attracted staunch followers and founded schools. The first one is Ben Jonson, the founder of the classical school of poetry. The other is John Donne. As a poet, he is remarkable for its concentrated passion, intellectual agility, and dramatic power. He is the founder of the so-called metaphysical school of poetry, of which Richard Crashaw, George Herbert, Henry Vaughan, and Abraham Cowley are the other leading poets. The term metaphysical, meta means beyond, and physical means physical nature. Physical is the concrete, means to transcend or go beyond the physical or concrete. This adjective metaphysical in the context of poetry was for the first time used by critic Samuel Johnson in his Lives of the Most Eminent English Poets 1779 to 81 in a chapter on Abraham Cowley. Johnson borrowed this term from Dryden's quote. About John Donne, he affects the metaphysics. Johnson used this term to refer to the group of writers under the leadership of John Donne belonging to the beginning of the 17th century. I have already quoted the names. They were Richard Crashaw, George Herbert, Henry Vaughan, Abraham Cowley, and other leading poets. John Donne established a style which inclined towards intellectual complexity. His fame rests on his wit and use of conceits in his poetry. We can say Donne's poems are heavily overloaded with conceits, which may be defined as the excessive use of over-elaborated similes and metaphors drawn from more far-fetched, remote, and unfamiliar sources. His scholarly allusions and display of specialized knowledge of various fields has always attracted attentions from critics and readers alike. He was therefore the flag bearer of the school of poetry, whose members are notable poets like Sir John Suckling, John Cleveland, Richard Crashaw, George Herbert, Henry Vaughan, Abraham Cowley, and Andrew Marvell. Donne and other metaphysical poets use the words which call the mind into play rather than those which speak to the senses or evoke an emotional response through memory. The followers of this school produce works which have a blend of emotion and intellectual ingenuity. The intellectual bias affects the forms of their poems and their rhythm. In their conceits, they constantly bring together the abstract and the concrete, the remote and the near, the spiritual and the material, the finite and the infinite, the sublime and the commonplace. Thus, Donne draws his imagery from such varied sources as medieval theology, scholastic philosophy, and Ptolemaic astronomy of the Middle Ages, and the concept of contemporary sciences. These poets have attempted to explain the emotional and spiritual aspects of life in terms of concrete images and logical reasoning. The fantastic nature of metaphysical conceits in poetry would become clear if we see the example of John Donne's poem Valediction Forbidding Mourning, in which two lovers now parted are likened to the legs of a compass. In the poem Flea, Donne deduces every kind of consequence from the fact that a flea hops from biting him to suck his mistress's blood. He will not let her kill the creature in which their blood has mingled and which is therefore their bridal bed, the temple of their wedding. In such passages, even Donne, the greatest of metaphysical, becomes extravagant. The poetry of the metaphysical writers laid emphasis on analyzing the feelings rather than on expressing the feelings. The most outstanding feature of their poetry is the use of wit, that is, finding analogies between disparate things and conceits, use of unusual comparison or images or extended metaphors, as I've told you about the poem Valediction Forbidding Mourning, in which John Donne uses the two lovers now parted are likened to the legs of a compass. Other distinct features of poets of this school are their use of colloquial diction, dramatic language, epigrammatic style, compression and brevity of expression, and an argumentative tone which is enhanced with literary devices such as pun, antithesis, irony, and paradox. These writers seek for the originality and newness and achieves them in different ways. T.S. Eliot, in his influential essay, The Metaphysical Poets, that appeared in 1921, appreciated metaphysical poets for achieving an association of sensibility. Is that their works embody a fusion of thought and feeling. We can say in Donne's poetry, there is always an intellectual analysis of emotion. Every poem arises out of some emotional situation, and the emotion concerned is analyzed threadbare. It is said that like a clever lawyer, Donne gives arguments after arguments in support of his points of view. Thus, in Valediction Forbidding Mourning, he proves that true lovers need not mourn at the time of parting. In the canonization, he establishes that lovers are saints of love. And in the poem Blossom, he argues against the Petrarchan love tradition. This imparts to his poetry a hard intellectual tone, and it results in that unification of sensibility for which T.S. Eliot praised the metaphysical poetry so highly. On the other hand, Samuel Johnson criticized John Donne poetry and called his conceits the most heterogeneous ideas yoked by violence together. Heterogeneous means diverse or varied ideas yoked. They are put or joined by violence together. So, if we have to summarize the metaphysical poetry or the movement that was led by John Donne, we can come to the conclusion that the poetry of John Donne and the other metaphysical school of writers attracted great attention. And though it is complex and difficult, it is intellectual in tone. There is an analysis of the most delicate shades of psychological experiences. It is the fusion of emotion and intellect. It is full of conceits which are learned, intellectual, and over-elaborated. In order to arrest attention, often a poem begins abruptly and colloquially, and unusual rhythms are used. It is often dramatic in form. So we can say that T.S. Eliot praised the metaphysical, appreciated the metaphysical poets for achieving an association of sensibility, whereas Samuel Johnson criticized John Donne for he felt that most varied concepts are brought together, brought by violence together. This is all about the metaphysical movement and the metaphysical poetry and the traits of or the chief characteristics of metaphysical poetry. I hope you like the video. Share, like and subscribe.